Every parent knows that kids have a ton of energy. I have 2 daughters myself, and I love them to death, but sometimes it seems like they have more energy than they know what to do with. What parent hasn't seen their kid figuratively bouncing off the walls and wondered, what is causing this behavior? Or more to the point, where's the off switch? Now, hyperactivity may be a natural part of just being young, but in some children it can actually be a disorder, a disability that's hampering school performance and making home life even more challenging. So the search for a cause and possibly a cure for excessive hyperactivity in kids has led down many blind alleys, has led to an industry of self-help books, leaving parents with a tremendous amount of information, including a lot of misinformation. One of the biggest hypotheses, and perhaps the biggest myth dealing with childhood behavior, is the food hypothesis, that children behave the way they do because of the food that they eat. This link, this notion that there's a link between food and hyperactivity goes back to the 1920s and has been controversial ever since that time. It was first mostly popularized in the 1970s by Benjamin Feingold, who created the Feingold diet. Now, this is a diet that removes many things from what children eat and claims that it actually eliminates or reduces hyperactivity and many other problems as well. So many foods are erroneously linked to behavior, going beyond just the Feingold diet. There are those who think that sugar is the culprit, others that it's food additives, perhaps caffeine, or some specific constituent of food like casein or gluten. Now, first, I'm going to give you a word on what we call confirmation bias. And I think this largely explains why there's a big disconnect between what the scientific community thinks about food and hyperactivity and what most parents, or many parents at least, think about food and hyperactivity. Now, parents may, for example, observe that their child has a ton of energy and their activity level is vastly increased, and they may think, well, what has caused this? Why are they suddenly bouncing off the walls? And they'll think back to what they maybe ate most recently and note that they ate something sugary or sweet, and therefore they make an association between the two things and may then assume a cause and effect, that the sweets caused the behavior. Now, we call that confirmation bias because people tend to make observations which confirm things that they already suspect or believe. If a child's not acting hyperactive, you may not bother to notice or ask the question, what did they eat in the last 30 or 60 minutes? And therefore, you won't notice that kids eat a lot of sugar at times when they're not acting particularly hyperactive. Also, when there is a correlation, it may not be so simple to assume what the cause and effect is. For example, children may be more likely to eat sweets, cake, and sugary stuff at birthday parties or other events that themselves are likely to contribute to increased energy and hyperactivity. So despite this common belief with its obvious source in just casual observations that most parents would make, there is no link, no evidence to support a link between eating lots of sugar, the kind of things that children eat quite a bit of, and any behavioral change. There have been many specific studies, and they've showed that there isn't even a correlation, that even when the parents were absolutely convinced that their child will have a significant behavior change after eating sugar, for example, or some sugary food, that under controlled observation and under blinded observation, when the children were fed, say, one food that is sugary and another seemingly identical food, however, that doesn't have nearly as much sugar, there was no correlation. The correlation turned out to be an entire illusion. Other than the sugar itself, there's also food additives, and again, this gets back to the Feingold diet that I mentioned, which was more about food additives. Now, a comprehensive review of the evidence performed in the 1980s showed that there is no link between additives in food and hyperactivity or behavioral changes. There's also a recent study, there are many studies, but I want to focus a little bit on a recent one that did show a weak correlation between food coloring and the parents noticing an increase in activity. However, interestingly, the correlation was not noted by the clinicians or by any objective clinical assessment. It was only noted by the parents. So we're left with, when we look at all the scientific evidence, two possible conclusions. Either there just is no real causal link between additives and behavior, and that we do see what we call noise in the data. If you do enough studies, you're going to get occasionally weak positive studies only in certain circumstances. So unless it's a consistent signal in the research, we usually don't make too much of it. Or it's possible that there is a mild effect in a small subset of children, 5% or so. That would explain the effect that was seen in that one small study. But of course, proponents of the notion that food additives will cause hyperactivity will focus on those few studies which seem to support their notions. You have to really look at all of the data and put it into context, and there's either a very small signal or no signal at all. However, once the belief was out there in the public, it took on a life of its own, and here we are, again, decades later, there is still this strong belief, despite the fact that decades of research has failed to find it. What about allergies? I get this one a lot. I've had parents tell me that they think that their child has a food allergy and that the reaction, the allergic reaction, is behavioral changes, that they become hyperactive. Well, real allergies cause skin rashes, breathing problems, sleeping difficulty, generally feeling under the weather, but allergies do not cause hyperactivity or other behavioral changes. Now, about 5% of children and 3 to 4% of adults have actual food allergies. Food allergies are real, and they can actually be very, very serious. Many people, for example, have allergies to peanuts or other nuts, and if they get exposed to it even a little bit, even being exposed to somebody else who is exposed to peanut butter, for example, they can have a severe allergic reaction. The most severe type of allergic reaction that people get is called anaphylaxis, where their airways can close up and they can stop breathing, and that can be actually fatal. In fact, the most common cause of animal death in the world is anaphylactic shock from bee stings. Bees kill many more people than sharks or any other things that we worry about. So what causes real allergies? It's a hyperreaction in the immune system. The immune system is doing its job, reacting to things in the environment, but in some people they have a hyperactive reaction, and that causes all of the consequences and all the symptoms that we talked about, but it doesn't affect the brain or behavior. Another common food behavior myth is dairy products. As similar with sugar, parents may observe behavioral changes. Now, if they're thinking that dairy is the link, if that's their bias, that is the observation that they'll make that will confirm their bias. They'll think, oh, did my child have any cheese recently? And they'll find that indeed they did, and that will confirm their belief of a link between dairy consumption and either behavioral problems generally, or sometimes specifically autism or autistic behavior. Now, autism is a real neurological condition in which children do have behavioral changes. They have problems with social interaction. Specifically, they may or may not also have some mental retardation to go along with that, or it may just be that the decrease in social interactiveness, but they do engage in sometimes repetitive behaviors and some other problematic behaviors, and parents of autistic children often believe that those behaviors are triggered by certain kinds of food, and dairy is one of the ones that is currently a belief that is out there and is very common. However, once again, scientifically, this has been examined. A 2010 study done at the University of Rochester, which reviewed all of the existing evidence, showed that there was no correlation between eating dairy and behavioral outcomes in autism, and in fact showed that there was no benefit to a diet that excludes dairy. Gluten is another compound that gets focus of attention for either autism or hyperactivity or behavioral problems in general. Gluten is a type of protein that is found in rye and wheat and barley. And in fact, there is a real and often serious medical condition that includes a sensitivity to gluten. It's called celiac disease. Now, people with celiac disease need to be on a gluten-free diet, but this is completely a separate syndrome from autism or ADHD or behavioral disorders. Celiac disease causes inflammation and damage to the intestines and may lead to malabsorption syndromes, which can in turn lead to nerve damage and other neurological symptoms. But celiac disease can be diagnosed with specific medical tests. We can fairly definitively diagnose it. If you don't have abnormal testing for celiac disease, then you don't have a gluten sensitivity and you don't have to worry about it. Further, despite whatever the theoretical connection might be between gluten and behavior, scientists have just looked and asked the question, well, if we put children with autism or other behavioral problems on a gluten-free diet, does it help? Now, that same 2010 University of Rochester review looked at all the studies that looked at gluten and the gluten-free diet, and they found, again, bottom line, there was no evidence of any benefit to a gluten-free diet and the behavioral issues of children with autism or other children. Caffeine comes up frequently as well. Now, children have access to caffeine in soda, iced tea, and chocolate. Perhaps chocolate's their most common source of caffeine, and people need to remember that that is a source of caffeine also. Now, again, it's very plausible that caffeine, which is a stimulant that may give kids more energy and make them more hyperactive, but just as it turns out, that effect seems to be too minor to detect clinically when you study it. So it doesn't cause hyperactivity itself. In fact, and this seems somewhat counterintuitive, but because caffeine is a stimulant, it may in fact improve attention. It may stimulate the frontal lobes to function a little bit better, and it may paradoxically decrease hyperactivity or improve attention in children. Now, high doses, however, can cause jitteriness and nervousness and sleep difficulty, especially those who haven't been taking caffeine for a while. You do become tolerant to the effects of caffeine over a while, meaning even after a few weeks of regular caffeine use, you don't respond as much to all of these effects. And no one's recommending that caffeine in high doses be used in kids to treat any of their symptoms. But if anything, caffeine may reduce inattention or hyperactivity, not make kids bounce off the walls. This leads us to a disorder, as I spoke about, of hyperactivity and inattention, or ADHD, attention deficit with hyperactivity disorder. Now, of course, there is a spectrum of behavior among kids. Some kids are more hyperactive than others. There is a typical spectrum of behavior that we've seen in children, but between 3 and 7% of children will be far enough to the hyperactive end of that spectrum that it begins to impair their ability to function at home and in the school or in other situations. And then that's when it gets this label of ADHD and becomes the focus of treatment. Now, this is best understood in terms of what is ADHD. What is it? It's best understood as a relative deficiency of what neuroscientists call executive function. Executive function comes from our frontal lobes, the most recently evolved and therefore we think the most developed part of the human brain, which gives us the ability to essentially control our lives, to look at the big picture, to think about the consequences of our actions, and to inhibit our more primitive emotions and instincts in order to strategically plan the kinds of activities that we do in our lives. Primarily, you could think about it as a filter by which we inhibit behaviors which may be self-destructive or inappropriate. That actually is a very energetic, demanding function that uses up a lot of our brain resources. Now, people with children and adults with ADHD, when we look at their brain function with either an electroencephalogram to look at the electrical activity or functional MRI scan to look at how active different parts of the brain are, they have a relative decrease in the activity in those parts of their frontal lobes that are responsible for this executive function. So all the pieces do fit together fairly nicely, that ADHD is an executive function disorder. How is it diagnosed? This is the tricky part. There's no blood test, there's no MRI scan, there's no definitive, objective, biological test to say who has ADHD and who doesn't have ADHD. Further, as I said, it's a spectrum, and continuums or spectrum do have that problem where there's no absolutely objective place to draw the line. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some people who are far enough to one end of that spectrum that we can't identify them as having a disorder worthy of attention. ADHD is what we call a clinical diagnosis. A clinical diagnosis, like migraines and many other things in medicine, are diagnosed by having a certain number of symptoms which are characteristic of that disorder. For ADHD, it's impulsivity, hyperactivity, and inattention. Now, children or adults who have ADHD, in order to meet the criteria for that diagnosis, need to have at least 6 specific symptoms. They need to be of at least 6 months duration, and they need to be present in 2 or more different settings. So if they're only observed at school but nowhere else, you do not meet the criteria for the diagnosis of ADHD. Or if you have just 4 of those symptoms, you don't meet the criteria. You need to have a certain threshold. Yes, it's a little arbitrary, but again, you have to draw the line somewhere. And what researchers and scientists do is say, well, does this correlate with anything? If this is the criteria that we have, yes, it's fuzzy around the edges, but if we use this criteria, does it predict outcome? Does it predict who's going to do well in school, who's going to be successful in the workplace? Does it predict things like divorce rate and the risk of being imprisoned? And it turns out when you strictly apply these clinical diagnostic criteria, it does predict those things. Now, studies like as I mentioned, the EEG and the MRI, and also now we're finding genetic links to susceptibility to ADHD. These are important for research to help us understand the disorder, but none of them are specific enough yet to be useful in the clinical setting. What do we mean by a disorder? I've called ADHD a disorder. It's not a pathological disease. You can't look at cells under a microscope and see that they're pathologically abnormal. What a disorder means in the psychological or psychiatric context is that people with a disorder lack some function, in this case executive function, that is typically possessed by most people, and the relative decrease or lack of that functionality leads to demonstrable harm. That's the definition of a disorder, and ADHD meets that definition. For example, 1/3 of people with ADHD drop out of high school, and also only about 5% complete a university degree compared to 40% of the population, of their peers matched in other ways. That's a 35% absolute decrease from 40 down to 5% of getting a university degree. That's a pretty significant difference in educational outcome. How common is ADHD? Well, the name ADHD arose in 1980. However, if you look back in the medical literature, you will find clinical descriptions of ADHD going back to the 1800s. And this is very common. We have modern names for medical entities, but if you just look at the actual details, you will see that physicians and scientists were describing these same syndromes even 100 or more years ago. By the strict diagnostic criteria, which would be found in what we call the DSM, now on the 4th edition, going on to the 5th edition, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, about 3 to 8% of children will meet the criteria for the diagnosis of ADHD. And about 50% of them will have symptoms and will continue to meet that criteria that persist into adulthood. So it is a bit of a myth that all children with ADHD will outgrow their symptoms. Only 50% do, which means 50% will continue to be full-fledged ADHD sufferers even into adulthood. Is ADHD a uniquely American disorder? That is another myth I hear quite frequently, I think intended to say that it's not a real disorder, because if it were real, then people would have it in every country. It must be cultural because we only see it in the United States. In fact, in January of 2002, an international consortium of scientists signed a consensus statement. Here again, we have a consensus of experts reviewing all the evidence up to that point. And they said, and I'll read you the full quote of their statement, "We fear that inaccurate stories rendering ADHD as a myth, fraud, or benign condition may cause thousands of sufferers not to seek treatment for their disorder. It also leaves the public with a general sense that this disorder is not valid or real or consists of a rather trivial affliction." Their concern was that The myth that ADHD might not be real is causing demonstrable harm, mainly keeping people from treatments which may be helpful or may ameliorate the downside of having ADHD. And they also recognized it as a truly international disorder. It is not uniquely American. Another claim that comes up quite frequently, it's a perfectly legitimate question to ask. Is ADHD overdiagnosed? I think we need to ask similar questions about anything that is diagnosed in 3 to 7% of the population. You might argue, especially children. They are an especially vulnerable population, and we need to do absolute due diligence to make sure that we're using our diagnostic criteria appropriately. Specifically with clinical criteria, where there is this fuzziness around the edges, we want to really ask the question in every way possible, are we using this diagnosis properly? Are we diagnosing it when it should be and not over-diagnosing it, especially if over-diagnosis could lead to inappropriate treatment? Well, this has been specifically studied. And for example, if you compare the false positive rate to the false negative rate, false positive means you give somebody the diagnosis when they don't really have it. False negative means that you fail to diagnose somebody when they do in fact have the disorder. If ADHD were overdiagnosed, you would expect that the false positive rate would exceed the false negative rate. But whenever this has been looked at in specific studies, they find that in essence there's no difference, and that ADHD is actually not overdiagnosed, despite the very common popular belief that it is. Now, of course, this is looking at physicians diagnosing ADHD by the published established criteria. This doesn't mean the casual diagnosis of parents or teachers or other people. That's a different story. And perhaps that's where we need to rein in the diagnosis. We can't just assume that because a child superficially seems hyperactive that they have ADHD. They really do need to have a medical assessment. This is all especially important because ADHD is very treatable. One type of treatment involves CNS stimulants. If you remember when I was talking about caffeine, stimulants can paradoxically inhibit hyperactivity. That, again, seems like the exact opposite of what you would expect to happen. But when you drill down a little deeper, we understand now that what's happening is that these stimulants are increasing the activity of the frontal lobes, which is a huge part of our brains, and a very, very demanding energy intense part of brain activity. It uses up a lot of brain resources. Stimulants increase that amount of brain activity, enabling us to better inhibit our behavior. So you increase inhibition, that results in decreased hyperactivity. And that we now have a vast literature to show that this approach, using short-term stimulants during parts of the day when people need to have increased attention and need to be able to inhibit their behavior, like at school or even at work, that's a very successful strategy in coping with this disorder and in reducing the negative consequences. There is also evidence that behavioral modification is very helpful as well. And in fact, we may combine these approaches of using medication when necessary and behavioral modification. What type of behavioral management is helpful? Whether or not a child is under the care of a physician who's treating a disorder, these are some useful rules of thumb that are helpful in getting children less hyperactive and better under control, if you will. These are the recommended and proven methods that work. One is a daily routine. Kids respond well to specific and clearly delineated boundaries and consistency. If the rules are changing every day, that just makes them anxious. It makes them ignore the rules because they're not consistent. Positive reinforcement is also very important. When kids do behave well, they should be positively reinforced for that. However, on a side note, it's very interesting. Many parents will reward children for doing a quote-unquote good job, when in fact the evidence shows that telling a child good job can be counterproductive. It actually makes them anxious that if they don't do a good job the next time around, they won't get the praise or the positive reinforcement. It's far better to tell a child you've made a great effort, to reward their effort. Effort is one thing that children are 100% in control of. They're not always in control of the outcome, but they are in control of how much they try. So praise children for making a good effort, not necessarily for the net outcome. Also, children need clear rules and instructions and expectations. If there's any uncertainty, that really will short-circuit your attempts at controlling their behavior or giving them positive feedback. And there needs to be consistent consequences to their unwanted behavior. Essentially, you can't let them get away with it. If you tell them, if you do this behavior, you have to make the consequences something you will follow through with. You can't make unrealistic consequences, and you have to absolutely follow through with them every time. And children will respond to that consistency. And you should communicate with the child's teachers. Children may spend a large part of their waking life in school under the observation of their teachers. So as parents, if you have any issues about your child's behavior, make sure that you communicate with all of their teachers. And finally, it is recommended that you just set a good example for your children. Is ADHD overtreated? This is a related question to is it overdiagnosed, but not necessarily the same thing. We have certain criteria for diagnosis, but that doesn't mean that everyone who meets that criteria needs to be treated. In a 2007 review published in the Journal of Attention Disorders, it showed that children, in fact, were not generally over-medicated for ADHD, that the indications that are evidence-based are generally being followed. There is an increase in the use of medication over recent years, but studies have also shown that this increase in use is mainly because previously underserved populations are now being treated. So people who should have been treated but weren't because they weren't seeking medical care are now increasingly being treated. So therefore the number of people being treated is going up, but that doesn't mean it's being overtreated. A higher percentage of people with ADHD are being treated, that's all. There are individual cases, of course, of improper treatment. So I'm not suggesting that there isn't anyone out there who is being overtreated or being inappropriately treated. And of course, if you have any concerns about this for yourself or a loved one, you should seek a second opinion and make sure that you're really doing the right thing. But there is no systematic overdiagnosis or overtreatment that we can detect in the research literature for ADHD. So while ADHD is a genuine disorder, it is also part of a spectrum of typical childhood behavior. And it is highly treatable. We have very effective methods of improving behavior and improving outcome in children. There's also a lot that we've learned about what to do just for your typical child who has the typical range of hyperactivity, the kind of thing that all parents deal with. But it's important to note what does not cause hyperactivity or behavior changes in children. There are a great number of myths out there about what triggers it and what causes it, a lot of it revolving around food, sugar, caffeine, food additives. These serve as a distraction from the truth, and that is one of the big downsides of myths. Misinformation, in fact, is often more harmful, more pernicious than just ignorance. Not knowing something is often not as bad as thinking you know something that turns out not to be true. Parents focus their efforts on highly restrictive diets that are very difficult, that in fact may cause more problems for their child because now they're spending their time trying to get their children to be compliant with a very restrictive diet. The Feingold diet, for example, removes hundreds of things that children normally eat that they're not allowed to eat under that diet. You're better off focusing on basic parenting skills, forming a working relationship with your children, and focusing on the basic behavioral modification that we've known for decades is very effective.